Thank you for coming to the second session of Feminism and Race. And today we're going to talk about the music industry. So I'm going to share my screen. I wanted to talk about the music industry and feminism, and I thought who better to include than Beyonce and Taylor Swift, because they're two figures that are kind of pretty internationally recognized, not only on their levels of popularity, but they've also both like outed themselves as feminists. So I included two quotes on this page that they have. They've said kind of similarly what they define a feminist as, which is someone who believes in equal rights for men and women, or that men and women should have equal rights and opportunities. And I think it's interesting based on not only their different or similar fan bases, that they thought it was important that they come out publicly and declare themselves as feminists and perform with the word feminist behind them on the stage and kind of try to create more of an understanding or more of a discourse on what feminism is. So after I talk about kind of what I thought to be the important parts of each of their careers, I want to look at behind the scenes of the music industry, not only at like what kind of smaller artists will experience with the pay gap and through the productions of their albums or their films or their music videos, and kind of like the male domination in the music industry, and look at colorism in the music industry. So before we talk about Taylor Swift and Beyonce, I wanted to give a quick little recap of last time for anybody who was unable to come. So we really defined what feminism and intersectionality meant, like not only to each of us, but what predominant figures in this field have talked about with feminism and intersectionality. So I gave a little bit of a history of second wave feminism, which is kind of was considered glass wave or bourgeoisie feminism that really only included white women. And I talked about Kimberly Crenshaw coining the term for intersectionality as a form of feminism that would include other groups that were experiencing multiple oppressions, such as homophobia, classism, transphobia, racism, et cetera, besides that of just sexism. So I think, again, that we all kind of came to the conclusion that it's really important to fight feminism. You can't address it individually or try to separate race from class or sex oppression. So I wanted to, again, start with the timeline like I did last time, so we can get some context for their careers. And from the outset, I just want to be clear that I'm talking about, like, obviously more recent time. It's from 2009 forward. And clearly Beyonce is older than Taylor Swift. So like at the point of this starting, Taylor Swift is only 19 years old, but Beyonce is a bit older than her. And so a lot of these events that may have happened more recently and have been more publicized could just as easily have happened to Beyonce and not been publicized. And just like to acknowledge the fact that Beyonce has likely experienced the same discriminations and the same microaggressions that Taylor Swift has, but she's a lot more private about her life and doesn't give as many interviews. So we don't really necessarily see that as publicized. So I thought that a good place to start would be the 2009 VMA Awards, which I feel like most people know about, where Kanye West interrupted Taylor Swift when she was accepting her award and says that Beyonce should have won instead of her. And so this is when Kanye is pretty big. Like, he's 32 years old, he's pretty well known, and she's like just coming into the industry. So like obviously that had to be pretty devastating for her in front of like maybe one of her first times going up on stage and accept an award. And this older male artist is basically saying that you don't deserve to win the award. And I thought it's a good way to set the stage, because Beyonce then later calls her back up on stage and lets her finish her acceptance speech. So I think it sets the stage for the fact that both of these women aren't really like, they're not pitted against each other, like they're not competing. Beyonce like wanted to uplift Taylor Swift as well and like allow her to accept her speech, because even if Beyonce didn't win, they both had as much of a right and had worked on their art as much as the other person. So at the beginning of Taylor Swift's career, she's actually interviewed and she's actually decidedly a feminist and doesn't really understand what feminism is. So I thought that was interesting, because then 2 years later, she publicly declares herself a feminist, which is the same year that Beyonce releases Flawless, which she excerpts some of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's TED Talk, which I had everyone watch for last time, in that song, which is pretty interesting. And she performs with feminists highlighted behind her at the MTV Music Awards. So again, like in this timeline, I really wanted to intertwine the idea that producers and directors and behind the scenes workers are so male in this industry. And it's a huge deal in 2015 that Jody Gerson becomes the first woman CEO and chairwoman of a major music publishing industry. And even when you look on Wikipedia, it calls her a chairman. Like, it doesn't even call her a chairwoman, but I changed it because I feel like that should be a word that's used. And that obviously like opens up the opportunity for, or the door for other women to follow in her suit. And a year later, Beyonce launches her own music label with Parkwood Entertainment and signs a lot of pretty big names. So it shows like how important, like one person does it and then everybody feels like it's just that much easier for someone else to do it afterwards. And she also launched a new clothing brand that year called Ivy Park and performed at the Super Bowl, which I'm going to talk about both of those things later. And then to make a larger connection to the issue of colorism in the music industry and how a lot of male artists will rap about, like with a preference to lighter skinned Black women, Kodak Black notoriously stated in an interview and then later on Instagram that he wouldn't want to date a dark-skinned woman and it's not his forte to deal with a dark-skinned woman. So I just wanted, that's like something that we'll talk about in the discussion later. Later, then we also see Taylor Swift suing David Muller for $1 for groping her, who was a radio show host, which I think is really important to see that she only sued him for $1. So it shows she's not doing it for the money. She's not lying about it. She's doing it on principle for justice, that this has happened to a lot of other women who haven't been able to speak out about it and maybe wouldn't necessarily have won in the suit because they don't have the kind of notoriety that Taylor Swift has. So it's really important that she did this and actually won the case. And it shows like this abuse of power against women is happening all the time in the industry. It's happening with what's happened with Kesha, what's now coming out about Britney Spears. So it's not individual to Taylor Swift. And again, more recently, in the video that I had everyone watch about Taylor Swift, she talks about Scooter Braun, who has bought the rights to her intellectual property and her music, or her masters, which is like the rights to her music. So I think that again shows that she's received ongoing bullying from him throughout her career, and he's now profiting from her music. So it's just like all these things that are happening to women in the music industry. That's just kind of what I wanted to focus on throughout the presentation. Okay. So on to Beyonce. I obviously can't sum everything up about her in 2 or 3 slides, but I did my best. So she's the most nominated woman in Grammy history and the highest paid Black musician of all time. And she stated early in her career that she rarely felt represented, and that's why she kind of wanted to amplify the beauty and everything and get better representation in the music industry. So I put this picture of her Vogue takeover in the corner, and I just wanted to give that as an example of how she always works to amplify all voices, because when she was doing this Vogue takeover, she made sure that Tyler Mitchell was her photographer, and he was the first African-American photographer to shoot for the cover of Vogue. So she didn't just work her way to the top by herself and like kind of leave everybody behind. Like, she constantly works to uplift every voice. And it's also a huge deal that she's the CEO and chairwoman of her own entertainment company. She produces and directs her own projects. Like, she's really in control of her image. She doesn't take too many interviews. She is, and even with Parkwood Entertainment, she hires more women to lead. So she really is always constantly working to be a feminist actively and hire these people to lead in her company. But despite her high success levels, you still see her losing awards at the Grammys or at the MTV Movie Awards to Taylor Swift or Adele. And these artists come out publicly and say, like, we don't think that we should have won. We still think that Beyonce should have won. So there's still the kind of discrimination against women of color at the awards shows too. So this is the music video for Formation that I had people watch before coming today. And this music video is really political, and it had imagery from Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and as well as imagery about the Black Lives Matter movement. And she's bringing up the fact, with having the music video take place in New Orleans, that the government at the time of Hurricane Katrina didn't pay attention as much to what was going on because of its mostly Black community. And one of the other fellows who was presenting yesterday brought up how Kanye West famously said George W. Bush doesn't care about Black people in relation to how the government reacted to Katrina. But again, like the music video is not only about that, it's about her heritage, it's about her roots, it's about her family. She's really kind of including a lot of her feelings in this video. And she shows her daughter in the video, and I included like this little excerpt from an article that was literally in Huffington Post, where they talk about how her daughter, who was 3 at the time, had an offensive hairstyle. They talk about that she should be brushing her daughter's hair. There's like controversy. There was apparently like a poll of people trying to get her to brush her daughter's hair. So in the music video, she shows her daughter with natural hair, which is not an unconscious choice to kind of be like, it's okay if her hair like is looking curly and looking natural. And one of the most powerful parts of imagery that I thought in the video is that of a small child dancing in front of police officers in riot gear, which was a scene reminiscent of police officers in Ferguson. And when this video came out, a lot of the reaction were people being a bit shocked that she was being so outwardly political and so outwardly Black. And again, like this is an attack on Black women, the sentiment that people can listen to her music when she's talking about love and sex. And then when she talks about her political beliefs or her Blackness, people are uncomfortable or they don't want to listen to her music anymore. So in this video, she's really owning everything about herself. She's owning her femininity and her Blackness and her intersectional feminism. And so then at the Super Bowl, she again performs Formation. I don't know how many people have seen it, but a lot of people found it to be really controversial, and law officers were like kind of in an uproar and wanted to boycott her and boycott her concerts after she performed this. And she dressed in an outfit that was kind of like an homage to the Black Panther Party. And her dancers went in an X in the middle of the performance for Malcolm X. So even like Rudy Giuliani came out and said that it was an attack on police officers and said, this is football, not Hollywood. So it just kind of like the reaction was really like anti-Beyonce to this performance. And she came out later and spoke, anyone who perceives me as anti-police is completely mistaken. I'm against police brutality and injustice. These are two separate things. So she always like is clear about what her message is supposed to be, even when people don't really understand what she was trying to say. And then, so I asked everyone to watch Homecoming because I feel like it really shows her power and her ability as a performer to uplift so many voices and include so many people in her performances. But it also shows her talent as a director and a producer, because like you see throughout the music video or the documentary that she's trying to make it feel like you're at the concert when you're watching the documentary, which I think is really difficult. Like if you're filming a video to make it feel like you're present, but when you watch it, it does feel that way. Like you feel like the beat of the drum is like right in front of you. Like you feel like you're present at the concert, which, so she really accomplished it as a director. And this is all after she had just had children too. Like she's recovering from her pregnancy and still was able to accomplish this. It also had a huge impact for historically Black colleges and universities and getting more notoriety. And people were definitely researching a lot more on HBCUs after the performance. And their outfits were kind of supposed to be like a marching band outfit to be like an homage to the HBCUs. So Taylor Swift is someone who, again, like at first wasn't really considered a feminist. And when she was first coming out with her songs, they'd be about like girls stealing her boyfriend or like Romeo saving her. But throughout her career, she's kind of changed her tune and changed what she writes her songs about, which is why I had people watch the music video for The Man. But obviously this doesn't come without criticism. Like for example, when her music video for Bad Blood came out and Anaconda was not nominated at the same time, Nicki Minaj tweeted, of course, when her video comes out with her with thin, light-skinned women in her music video, she's gonna get a nomination, but Anaconda will not. And Taylor initially thought that this is a dig at her and kind of felt like, well, I've only uplifted women, like I've never said anything against you, like why would you criticize me like this publicly? But then she later apologized and realized like, not only does Nicki have to deal with sexism in the music industry, she's also dealing with racism. But again, like criticisms that Taylor has received is that her brand of feminism only includes thin, mostly white models. And that even up on the stage with her, this is like a picture that I found from an award show that all the producers that were with her for the award that she's winning are all male. So she's criticized for like not uplifting women, which again, I don't really know now like how much has changed since then, so I don't want to comment too much on it, but that's what it seems like from this picture. And then now I'm gonna move on to the next part, but I wanted to include these pictures just showing that men have come out calling themselves feminists. I think John Legend is maybe the only male music artist who has done it, but it's interesting, like we want to talk about that, or I want to talk about that in the discussion later too, like why haven't more male artists come out and publicly and felt the need to declare themselves as feminists? So I know that most people know the pay gap in general between men and women, but there were some statistics that kind of surprised me about the music industry. Mainly even just the fact that 1 in 4 female music artists experience being the only woman in the recording studio. And there were a lot of interviews, like I watched one with Rosalia where she said she was filming a music video and she was the only woman who was there. And it's like, if a lot of the people who are going to be watching these videos are women, it's kind of surprising that that's the way that they would market it or work on it in general. And even with songwriters, 12.3% of songwriters out of 600 songs were women. So there's not even the representation in who's writing the songs, who's behind the scenes, who's producing it, who's working in music tech. And even in the big companies like Sony, Warner Music, or Universal, they indicated that little to no women are in leadership positions. And the bonuses are given to employees that are disproportionately men. So in the view of the public, it can really look like there are a lot of big female stars when you're like looking at who's like in the top 100 or like who you're listening to on the radio. It seems like Ariana Grande is a lot on the radio, but only in 2019, at least 82% of songs that were played on like the top 100 only had at least one male performer. So only 18 out of 100 songs were performed primarily by women. So even like with who was chosen to perform at Coachella or getting representation at music festivals or winning the award shows, a lot of times it's going to be the men. So it's just interesting to look at, particularly with like the songwriting and behind the scenes credits. And then I also wanted to talk about colorism and how that is seen in music videos. So I took some definitions from How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibrahim X. Kendi, who's defined colorism as a collection of racist policies that rationalize inequities with racist ideas, claiming that the inequities between dark people and light people are not due to racist policy, but are based on what is right or wrong with each group of people. And then this is just like a simpler or shorter definition that preferring white women over black women is racism, but preferring light-skinned black women over dark-skinned black women is colorism. So I think this is something that's seen a lot in music videos, and it's important to talk about, that a lot of Black artists will perpetuate these ideals or rap about a preference to lighter skinned women and as finding light skin more desirable and it's considered more feminine, whereas dark skin is considered more masculine. And you can see this even with Destiny's Child. When Beyonce had such huge success in the US, Kelly Rowland really didn't have success in the US, and she eventually had more success in Australia, but that's something that's like throughout American culture is occurring. So we can talk about that in the discussion later too, just like how each person has seen colorism in music videos or things that are being spread or shared by the music industry. But the flip side of colorism is artists like Ariana Grande who are actually darkening their skin and trying to appear as if they're racially ambiguous, which happens through kind of trying to appropriate different cultures. And then I wanted to include this picture. These are just some like snapshots that I took from different music videos, some that are in music videos that were made by the female artists or some that were made by male artists, just looking at either how they chose to represent themselves or how men chose to represent women. And so the fact is often that in male artist music videos, the women are really not wearing that much clothing, or you don't even see their faces in the video, you only see different parts of their bodies, effectively treating them as an object who is there for male pleasure or to dance for money. So the problem is the assumption is that displays of feminine sexuality or displays of sexual availability. And I think like people watch these music videos, like this is public, like everybody's watching these, and that kind of like changes your perception of women, like whether you like it to or not, because it gets into your subconscious. So I was reading some interviews with FKA Twigs, who she brought up that the problem is not that women of color are over-sexualized in music videos. It's that they're absent from the dominant culture or from discussions about these cultural issues. So I think if women kind of take control of how they want to be perceived or represented in these music videos, that's really important. But there's still other videos that exist where we're really not seeing the women's faces. So now we'll move on to the discussion. So I'll stop sharing my screen and then I'll put the questions in the chat. But if there's any specific things right away that people just feel like they want to talk about with either Beyonce or Taylor Swift, or even specifically maybe why no male artists have really publicly come out and declared themselves as feminists or felt the need to do so, go ahead and raise your hand if you have any comments.
Hey, Jackie.
Hi.
Hi. Sorry, I was a little bit late. I was a little bit late to come into it. Looked like a great presentation. I just wanted to answer one of the questions you had on the slide, and I think are you going to put the questions in the chat?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do right now.
Okay.
Do you want me to try to find the question?
No, so there was a question. Okay, so the question about colorism. I think you're absolutely right that dark-skinned women, of whom I am one, are always sort of on the outskirts of where the attention is. And I think one way that we saw that was when Indiari and Alicia Keys were coming up. They came up at the same time, and Indiari is extremely talented. Her music was so empowering to so many people. And yet when they both were nominated for the Grammys, Alicia Keys won all the Grammys. Now, Alicia Keys, she's talented too. And her songs were very popular, but her songs and her persona seemed to attract a much wider audience. Indiari is like my skin color. Her songs were about Black girls and standards of beauty and all of that. And I don't think her songs really were identified with by white women, and so or other people. So for that reason, she did not get the attention, and Alicia Keys did. But again, both of them really talented. I just think it's a great way of showing the problems of colorism in pop culture. Looking at formation, and because you had sent us that email this morning, and I was trying to do all my homework. I've watched that video many times, but I watched it again with fresh eyes, and I was struck by one frame. And the frame was when Beyonce puts, she's talking about her baby, right? And so she's got Blue Ivy in the frame, and Blue Ivy is flanked by two other kids, and those two other kids are darker skinned kids. I just thought it was interesting that even at that level, you know, there is a attention to how do we make. She was thinking, how do I make my kid look even brighter, right? And in so doing, she got two darker skinned kids. I just thought it was interesting and a good way of showing how the problem, yes, it starts off in the society, you know, all this colorism comes all the way back from slavery. It comes from separating the darker skinned enslaved people from the lighter skinned and enslaved people, putting some in the house and some in the field. And so that has continued on, right? So that has seeped into the very fabric of our society and has affected even Black people within the way we see each other. And this thing is not just here in the US, but it's also global, which is why a lot of Black people are bleaching in places like Africa, and even brown-skinned people are bleaching in places like India. It comes from that legacy. So I just wanted to weigh in on it, and I'll talk about Taylor Swift afterwards, but this was a good question.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in. Yeah, I also thought it was an excellent presentation, Jaqui. Really, really well done. And yeah, I'm wondering, just following on Stephanie's point about how colorism in society, affects and then gets sort of reflected in colorism in music industry and in art and in Hollywood and things like that. That it seems that what's needed is more artists, like you see Beyonce do at times, and Taylor Swift in the Man song and video, where they kind of try to not simply give audiences what they want, but start to give them some things and some representations and ideas that they think would be good for them. That they should have, kind of push the direction of opinion in society, because I think that may be needed, because right now it seems to snowball, right? Because you sort of give the consumer what they want, and what they want reflects colorism and racism and that sort of, those sorts of things often, and sexism and perceptions of women that are not good for equal rights and things like that for women. And but that can become a cycle, it seems, right? So you need artists who are willing to kind of break that cycle. And maybe that speaks to some extent to John Legend, calling himself a feminist, that you need more artists to kind of, and thought leaders or opinion leaders like Taylor Swift and Beyonce are, to push society in directions that it's not comfortable going. That's just one thought about this.
Yeah, so to echo what Dr. Shonica and Dr. Seagrave said, I think amazing presentation. Something I thought of with this question of colorism, what you brought up was the moment that Beyonce releases Formation, and there is this odd, very, in my opinion, very weird, oh, Beyonce's now Black. There was this interesting, weird moment where it was oh, now she's talking about Black things, and, she's more in touch with her Blackness and things like that. And a part of me wonders, if her being lighter skinned and kind of following the trends that colorism has set kind of created a space wherein people could listen to her music and not think of her as a quote unquote Black woman making music. Because I definitely hear and see Black historic and current influences on Beyonce's style, on Beyonce's music, throughout most of her solo career, and definitely when she was with Destiny's Child. And so I think it's very interesting, how something like colorism might have very deeply shaped how audiences understood Beyonce, at multiple different moments in her life, and how, post Formation, it's interesting to see how the effects and expectations of colorism towards Beyonce have kind of shifted somewhat.
Yeah, to add on to that also and compare it a little to Taylor Swift's kind of political outing more recently, I think Taylor Swift had a very similar reaction when she started calling herself a feminist, and then later started actually talking about politics. And in her own documentary, which I haven't watched in a couple of months, so I don't remember exactly what it was she was talking about, but how when, I think it was during the 2016 election, she finally decided to come out and talk about politics, and everyone had this crazy reaction, wow, Taylor Swift has a brain beyond music, that's crazy. And I think Beyonce experienced a similar thing, but with race. And so I think that really exposes the difference between how the two of them can talk about feminism and politics, because Beyonce will always have to talk about feminism and race, and then Taylor Swift can easily float along the top of that feminist declaration. And I'm not really sure how much. I honestly don't follow her that much, but I'm not sure if she's ever talked about intersectionality or if that's a part of the feminism that she espouses. And I'm interested if anybody else has any comments about that.
I think that Taylor Swift maybe has said something out about intersectionality. But yeah, to your point about the documentary, that was about Marsha Blackburn running for Senate in Tennessee. And she was like publicly saying that she didn't want people to vote for Marsha Blackburn. And people on her team, like in the documentary, like told her not to say anything. And they referenced like the Dixie Chicks speaking about George W. Bush and how afterwards they like had less concert ticket sales and all these things. So they were like, it's basically career suicide if you become political as a musician. But there's been so many musicians in the past that have been political, like you see with Nina Simone, with Mississippi Goddamn. Like there's so many people that have done that and it's worked. So I think it's important that music artists are like always so intertwined with politics, and like if they feel the need to speak out, that they do.
I think, yeah, if I could just jump in too. I don't know if anyone else has their hand up or anything, but speaking to the point about intersectionality, and I wasn't able to make it to your first session, so I know you covered it more there, but it's, I was interested reading recently this article by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar talking about anti-Semitism, right, and the recent anti-Semitic statements made by some leaders of the movement for African-American rights and social justice, that there's some, an inconsistency there perhaps. And Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was talking about this, and that gets me thinking about these intersections of different social justice causes in different ways. And the fact that, as we're saying with, being a feminist doesn't necessarily mean that you're an anti-racist, right? I mean, those two causes can and have often been pursued separately by separate people, different people, sometimes at odds with each other historically, about which rights are more urgent or need to be gained first, and those sorts of things. And the fact that it's very different, the experience of being a woman and what you experience in terms of injustice is very different from the experience of being a Black man and what you experience in terms of that injustice, which is also very different from being a Black woman and what you experience in injustice there. There are overlaps, certainly, I'm sure, but it seems that it's difficult to, at the same time, talk about these different causes together and in their overlap, but then to nevertheless recognize the fact that that's not an easy transition for a lot of people to make, or an easy connection for a lot of people to make. And you need to do a lot of work to kind of see how these things are related to each other, because it's not obvious to everybody.
I think the question you bring up, Jackie, about like, why is John Legend the only man who's come out publicly, and are there others that feel that way, or what's the pressure that's preventing them from either thinking that way or feeling like they can say something like that. And I like the idea that you mentioned, Adam, about like breaking the cycle. And I think like male artists should have a responsibility, like in a similar yet different way, to break that cycle, where I imagine there's a lot of like images or just ideas of like strong masculinity, and they are feeling those pressures and feel like if they got behind the feminist movement that they'd be breaking that. And there's some risks similar to Taylor Swift becoming political. If they become feminists, then they'll be I don't know, just not as celebrated by their fans. So I haven't really thought about that before, so definitely I want to be more aware and looking out for that going forward.
I think also John Legend, the reason why he has come out as a feminist is because of Chrissy Teigen, like because I think they were out to dinner right after they had their first kid maybe, and someone was like, why is Chrissy out to dinner? But they didn't say that to him. And so that was where he was kind of like, why is she being treated differently than I am when we both just had a child and like we equally like wanted to go out to dinner? So like, why is she being kind of like shamed for going out and having a nice dinner right after having a child? And also to move on to like a different subject, I wondered if anyone wanted to talk about the recent situation with J. Cole and No Name. I know Dr. Shonikin, you brought that up last time. just given what we've learned about, like, this is the question, like, given what we've learned about Black women's experiences with sexism and racism, like, how do we understand that situation? Like, what does it mean with the context of what I just talked about in my presentation?
So again, I'm sorry, I missed the first part of the presentation, but I was at your last one. And I think that the J. Cole and No Name situation came up, I mean, this happened, about a month ago. And so for those who don't know, J. Cole had released a song, I can't remember now, the Snow on the Bluff, right? It's my son. And he actually was my son who brought it to my attention. And he was it was sort of a celebration of Black women, but it was also saying that Black women, it was kind of policing their attitudes or their speech in a way, right? He was saying that sometimes they come through with too much in an attitude that is hard to take. And I think No Name is someone who's really stood up for social justice, for women's rights, for Black women's rights. And I think that it was something about why J. Cole would do that. You know, why not just celebrate the Black woman and not throw shade on it, because it was shade, you know. And then it becomes, you know, why are we airing our laundry in public? Because J. Cole is a very public figure. He has a lot of white audience members. White folks love him just as much as Black folks do. And so to have the criticism from a Black man then becomes very difficult for Black women, you know, because, you know, we are both Black and we're women, you know. So it was an interesting series of events, and people were like, are you on J. Cole's side or are you on No Name side? And I know that my son and I had a long talk about it. But I wonder if anybody else, what anybody else thought about it, because he has a platform, you know, and that platform, it's similar to John Legend, you know, what do you want to use your platform for with regard to lifting up Black women, you know, that is the question.
Yeah, so I followed most of the situation on Twitter more than anything else. I saw Twitter reactions to J. Cole's song before I heard the song. And so I'm okay in saying that that experience on Twitter might have clouded how I felt about the whole situation. What stuck out to me the most about it was J. Cole's response, because it was very clear to me that it was a response that a Black woman would never be able to make. Like, to get on Twitter and say, I don't read, but this is how I feel about this. Like, the words I don't read that much were like in the tweet. Like, I'm not trying to be funny. Like, it was like, he effectively said, I don't read really about this as much as you do or whatever it is, but this is how I feel and this is what I've seen. And it was just, I don't know, there was something about, and I think it's something we see a lot, even if we don't characterize it as such, which is the kind of male privilege of being able to declare emotion as logic and say that I feel this way, therefore there is a truth behind it that is true to the world. Whereas when women do something similar, it is women are emotional and there is no logic behind it. And that is very much so how No Name's response was characterized, as if she responded too much, she'd be doing too much and she'd be too angry and, oh my gosh, it's not that big a deal, you know, he didn't call you out by name or anything like that. And then the response that she did gave when she put out the song, everyone was like, why would you even give him that much time and that much effort? You must be really upset about it. That means it's true that, you know, you're purposely talking down to Black men. And there's just a lot of tone policing all up and through the entire situation in a way that, of course, made me uncomfortable, but did make me think about like Black women, particularly in the music industry, and how much tone policing must go into not just like how they present themselves on social media and online, but within their actual songs, within their actual music, and within their even business relationships with other Black artists. And it was very interesting to see all of that like play out on Twitter. Specifically, I'm not gonna lie, guys, it's really just I don't think I will ever type a tweet that includes the words "I don't read." I can't imagine what goes into the thought process that like spits that out as
Elena, you're a soon to be PhD, so you certainly must never ever say that.
very true. But yeah, I'd like to hear other people's responses if maybe you didn't hear the music but saw like it all go down on Twitter, or saw like other people, individuals' reactions instead of just J. Cole and No Name's reactions, because that told me a lot about like how people were responding to the words of Black men and Black women differently.
Well, I guess if you don't follow J. Cole and No Name, you may not have seen it. So it's possible that a lot of people didn't even know this was going on. But it was really a good microcosm of a much wider problem. I know this is not in your questions, but but it's something that came up this week that I think has a lot to do with how we view a Taylor Swift or any other white artist who is getting woke now. And that is the Dixie Chicks, which I think you mentioned, Jaqui. So I heard they're planning to call themselves just the Chicks now. So Jaqui, so what do you think about that? You know, what do you think about the Dixie Chicks? Because I love the Dixie Chicks. I've been a long time fan, and certainly even became a bigger fan after their canceling. They were canceled by country radio. And I love how what they did musically after that, like right after that, their response to the cancellation was in itself a real action of empowerment. But now that they're planning to call themselves the Chicks, it makes me wonder what did they think Dixie meant? You know, like why did they call themselves the Dixie Chicks in the first place? I wonder what people think about that.
I think I don't know enough about them. Like, I don't know enough about where they're from. Like, maybe that's why they decided to call themselves that. But a lot of artists have just been changing their names, like Lady Antebellum too. But obviously that name is a little bit more necessary to change. So I don't entirely know like the history of the band, but I do know like Sarah recently shared with me, like they came out with a new album and they have a song called Gaslighter, I think, on it. So they've been coming out with music that's been like much more feminist. Madeline, go ahead.
Hello. I just wanted to add something. I don't know if when you were talking about Lady A, or Lady Antebellum, who they're changing their name to Lady A, I think. I just wanted to add this in for like discussion as well, because I was just reading something about them changing their name, as well as like a whole list of white artists that have like these questionable, like reminiscing the South, kind of like similar with the Dixie Chick, but it's like reminiscent of like plantation era. And they're like finally getting woke and changing it. But then Lady Antebellum got into this whole controversy, which I don't know if it's been resolved, where like they want to change it to Lady A, and there's like a Black woman musician who already uses that name, and they were trying to work together to like figure out the copywriting and licensing for that. And at first, like, they had come to some sort of agreement that they could share the name. And then the original artist, Lady A, who's a Black woman from, I think, California, was like no, she wanted to pull out of the agreement, and they were like I think they're suing her over that name. So people were like, this is very, I don't know a ton about it, but it's like worth talking about, because people are like, this is exactly like, it's just showy, you know, anti-racism, but it's on the inside, it's like they just want that name, so they go take it away from this woman who has been using it for like 20 years. So I thought that was like pretty messed up.
Yeah, that case was so interesting to me, Madeline, because it really did get to the core of the problem, right? So we put these Black Lives Matter yard signs up in our yards, right? And that's good. It's a great symbol. But then what is the foundation of that sign, you know? So you want to change your name to Lady A, find out that there's a person who already goes by that name, but you want that name. And so her career then goes down so that you can continue to rise. With the Dixie Chicks as well, there are blinders, I think, sometimes. I think we all have them, you know, we are human beings. We all have these blinders because of who we are, you know, so they were existing in their careers, they were doing well. They didn't have much thought to the fact that they were called Dixie, which is like a celebration of the Confederacy and the South. They became strong women's voices, but the racial thing was not something that they were thinking about because it wasn't in there. Again, it was blinders. Same thing with Lady Antebellum. I mean, that name, and I like their music too. I teach a whole class on country music, so I love country music. But those names say a lot about what you see and what you don't, what you care about and what you don't care about. And so for Taylor, I wonder if her recent wokeness, the speech that she gave that Jaqui shared, she talked about Lana Del Rey, who herself has had some recent issues with race. Yeah, so it's all very complicated, but sometimes when we talk about feminism, we forget that feminism itself has a history of itself being problematic, you know, and I think that we're seeing that with Lady A and with the Dixie Chicks, both of whom I really like.
If I can bring the conversation back like a few steps back to the J. Cole No Name situation, listening a little bit more to what you all had to say about it, I think this kind of answers our John Legend question too, that like No Name has this privilege as a man to just say like, oh, I don't really know what's going on, it's not my problem. And so I think that's kind of what a lot of male artists have the privilege to do, is that it's not their problem, and so they don't see it, and so they don't feel like they have to speak out about it. And it's the same thing for Lady Antebellum and for the Dixie Chicks, that race is not their problem, and so they didn't feel like they had to do anything about it until it's become this huge national issue yet again. They felt like they had the power to do something about it. But then again, it kind of feels like a band-aid in some ways, maybe the way that like a lot of cities are painting Black Lives Matter on the streets without really actually doing any structural change there. So I like that somebody put in the chat like what Madeline said about like showy anti-racism. It's like, how can you define which of your woke artists are actually woke, and are you going to cancel them if they're not? And I'm curious what people think about like if, for example, like Taylor Swift, this is more to do with like queer rights, but like with her her like Pride video, I don't know the name of it, that came out like a year ago, and it garnered a lot of criticism because it had all of these queer artists in it. It talked a lot about like LGBT pride, but then it still centered her, and somehow she still brought in like herself and Katy Perry into the main like plot of the music video. So she got a lot of criticism for that, that like, is she still just centering herself and using this to uplift her own image because people are talking about this and she feels like it's good for herself to be like, oh yeah, I totally stand with them. Or is she actually taking that to heart and doing something about it? And I think that goes for like a lot of artists, especially white artists and male artists.
Yeah, I really agree with everything you just said, Lainey. And more to your first point, I was following the J. Cole No Name songs as they released. So I didn't really follow like the public response to it, but I was kind of pretty disappointed like in his overall stance. And like there seemed to me like there was an element on one hand, like you said, where he's trying to like uplift Black women. He's trying to be like he's this nice guy giving support, but then there's a sort of it was like a backhanded compliment. Like at the end, he's like, well, you can talk about these issues, but only on my terms. You can't say it in the way that you are because that's too offensive to me, and that's not the conversation that he wanted to have. So that was just really disappointing to me, like the way that he sort of shut that down while trying to like still come out as the good guy in this. So yeah, I just thought that was an interesting stance that he had.
I also followed the J. Cole and No Name beef, is what I would call it, pretty well. And I was on Twitter. I have a lot of family from Chicago too, so a lot of No Name fans. And I would say it's important to point out that they both have pretty similar audiences. I would say they're both very conscious rappers, if you look at a lot of their lyrics. And they both, I want to say, have a majority white fan base for the most part. So I thought it was interesting that J. Cole went at No Name specifically because it almost seemed like it was this is my like territory type move. And it also came off super patronizing. I remember one of the lyrics was like, the queen tone, that's the part that's bothering me. It's like he almost like lists out No Name's like accomplishments, and she's good at being socially conscious, about being educated, about being well read. But like he just completely cuts himself up and says, it's something about the queen tone that's bothering me. So he addresses all of No Name's accomplishments with a complete sense of patriarchy almost, and just criticizes her for no reason at all, almost it seems like. And he's basically taking her off a pedestal that he doesn't want her on, maybe because she's kind of tilting into his audience, is kind of how I read it. And I remember a lot of Twitter reaction was like, what's like, Jacob, what are you doing? What's the point of this? Like, why are you doing this even at all? And I remember in some of his tweets, he addressed it. He was just like, yeah, like I think Yolanda was talking about. He's just like, like, I don't really read that much, but that's fine, right? At least I think. And that was just kind of a response. And I remember her response to his diss track, or to his track, was basically saying like, what's the point of this? Why are you coming at me? And wow, like congrats for like not wanting to be as educated as me. Congrats. And at the end, when everyone just really got on Jaqui after she released her diss track, he basically he was able to get away with it by just tweeting out her song. I'm pretty sure was the last thing he did for that. And he was just like, oh, this is fun. So it's just a complete disparity between what J. Cole did after the fact. And No Name probably really had to dissect her response. Wow, J. Cole, if you look through the lyrics of Snow on the Bluff, it's just like, I'm gonna list everything she did right and tell her she's wrong because she's acting too smart or something. But yeah, that's kind of how I read that whole controversy.
Yeah, I so agree with that analysis. I wonder if what you all think, those of you who follow Drake, what you think about Nice for What. You know, he came out with that a song called Nice for What about a year ago, I think. And I love the video. I don't know about I don't know about the song itself, but it is his way, I think, of trying to lift up Black women, because that video is it's like Serena Williams, and I mean it's all Black women in that video, and I think that was his way of trying to get at that, because Drake also has been embroiled at some moments in very questionable attitudes towards Black women. And so anyway, I don't know if anyone saw that or has a response to J. Cole, not J. Cole, but Drake, as someone with another very large white following. And that song being something that really stood out because of his sort of celebration of Black women.
Yeah, so I really like that song. I'm right now trying to think if I really like that song because I really like the song or because like it came on 20 times a day for a solid 4 months straight, and if you didn't like it, you just had to get in line. Um, but I think there's also something about like when we talk about male artists, and this was something I was thinking about earlier, but it kind of like slipped my mind. I wonder also about how within feminist spaces, within feminist groups that are predominantly woman-led, there are some that think that men cannot or should not declare themselves as feminists and instead possibly as allies of feminists because feminists is understood to be like women advocating for women. Now we can talk about whether or not we agree with that or not, but I think it's interesting that like so many of these artists in their own oddly misguided and often very tone deaf ways try and have these tracks that are uplifting women, Black women and all women, as like the summer bops. Like it's always the summertime where it's like a song about women loving themselves and having fun and dancing, and you know that's what's on the top 10 for the whole summer. And so I think it's interesting like how male artists are kind of allowed to dip their toes into feminist action and into feminist thought and not have to declare themselves feminists. At the same time, a part of me wonders if it's a no-win situation, because I do believe that at least if they were to declare themselves feminists, that there would be some pushback in people asking the question that people have been asking for years at this point, which is like, can men be feminists? And so I think it's I don't know, I think it's also kind of indicative of a very larger question that I don't know has a solid answer as of 2020 because it's been debated for so long. But it's interesting to me like to think of Nice for What and to think of some of these other songs that are about women enjoying themselves where they tend to get the most airplay when it's male artists doing it and not when it's female artists doing it. The only one I can think of right now would probably be the Chloe Haley Do It song, which is about like them going out with their friends or whatnot. But it takes you a couple of listens to realize that they're talking about just a night with them and their friends. Like you don't automatically know that the way you did with like Nice for What or something like that. So I don't know, I just thought that was interesting how like songs like Nice for What are like kind of sort of feminist in a certain way, but allowed to only be kind of sort of feminist because like there's no pressure on Drake to declare himself a feminist and do that properly and well. And you know, what would Nice for What look like if he was forced to do that to quote unquote be a good feminist?
I think that's a really interesting question and a really interesting point about can men be feminists? And I think that that definitely is part of a much larger conversation. And I don't want to speak for all women at all, but I think it is possible for men to be feminists. But something that we talked about last week is that feminists just, or not last week, last time, feminist isn't just a title, it's an action. And I think that in the music industry at large, men profit off of basically the opposite of feminism. Like men include misogynistic lyrics, the videos are very explicit, like against women, like a lot of the imagery and the lyrics and the themes that men use, obviously a large generalization in music, aren't feminist. And so I think that a lot of men would get a lot of flack for calling themselves feminists and then having that type of music out and profiting off of that. And so I think that it kind of needs to be like a larger change. I think we see that now with kind of, it's debatable how performative it is, but with bands changing their names to be less racist and things like that, there can be, I think, a similar switch towards more feminist or less misogynistic lyrics and visuals in the music industry. And I think that that's needed before I think there can be a large wave of men declaring themselves feminists.
I think I totally agree with that point, and I think it's really hard with artists that you like too. Like I was talking to Madeline the other day, like we really like Anderson .Paak, and then I watched the music video for Tints, and there's like strippers dancing and they don't even show their faces, and I'm like, I really like him, but then he's doing things like this, and like it seems so unlike him, and it's just weird. So I think like men just, and not like, again, in generalization, but like he's doing kind of what he wants. Like he doesn't have to declare himself a feminist. He can present women or represent women in this way in his music videos. And it's really frustrating because I'm like, I like him, but like, what is he doing in this music video? So it can be, yeah, I mean, I just really agree with everything you just said.
I think to go back to Drake, just to kind of segue a little, Drake's always had an interesting history in general because he's almost seen like a culture vulture a lot of the time. Like he borrows looks, trends, even music rhythms themselves from different cultures that he has no part of. Honestly, I think he's half Jewish. I don't know his makeup that well, but I know he carries like Afrobeat music, dancehall music, and he really has very limited background in these genres. And from songs like, I think Nice for What comes from there's a Lauryn Hill sample in there, for example. There's like New Orleans bounce music that it carries from. I know he uses a lot of Jamaican slang in his lyrics, along with a lot of like British intonations too, I would say. And like Drake really has no connections to this besides that's what he wants to be in his music. And people eat it up, people love it. Like I honestly love some of Drake's songs that have a lot of I don't know how to say things that aren't Drake. And I don't know, I guess that's just a segue for the discussion. We were talking about colorism earlier. I think I know that's not entirely colorism. I'm not sure what to call it, but yeah, I know he's probably the biggest artist in my generation, I would say, along with Beyonce, if I had to think of one. So it's just funny that the biggest artist of genre, or maybe that's why he's the biggest artist of our generation, because he borrows so much from so many different cultures and doesn't really talk about it.
Sebastian, I think that's a really interesting point. And so the question would be, how does he get away with it, right? Like if let's say what's his name, Sam Smith, what's his, you know, the British guy, if he were to like throw on some patois and try and do a little bit of reggae or something, you know, he would be canceled. But somehow Drake is able to do a little Jamaican stuff. He does a little Afrobeat. Yeah, he brings in a Nigerian Nigerian Afrobeats guy by the name of Wizkid. He's able to really do these things. And I would say even Nice for What is him also like borrowing and putting his toes in many waters. Again, he gets away with it. But do we think he gets away with it because he is sort of biracial? Like we didn't know what his kid looked like, so he could keep being as biracial as possible. He appropriates blackness because, you know, I guess his dad is black. And then he was on that show that I don't know. Why does Drake get to do these things? Because before Sebastian said that, I hadn't questioned it. You know, I was just like, yeah, he's Drake, he can do that. You know, but why does he get away with it? And I think to Sarah's point, even Nice for What might be, it's marketable, you know, it's sold. I mean, I bought it, right? So is he a feminist for doing that? You know, is he a sort of a well-rounded Renaissance man for dipping into all those cultures, or is he just using them to appropriate and profit and so on? I don't know. I'm now thinking again about Drake's position, given what Sebastian just said.
I think, like, to answer the question of like why we let Drake get away with it, I think is, well, one, I'm not quite sure we let him get away with it, because every time a song comes out with a different accent, like all of Twitter is like, oh man, he's at it again. What? Like, apparently, like, photos just surfaced of him in Barbados and everybody was like, oh hell, you know, like, what's gonna happen in a month? You know? And so I think but I think there's something about, I don't think it's because of his biracial identity. I think it's because he's leaned so heavily into Blackness that he's kind of like made he talks about Toronto, his home, as being very multicultural Black, meaning kind of similar to New York City. There's a lot of different West Indian and other like Black cultures happening within the city, instead of quote unquote just African American Blackness or something of the sort. And so I think he kind of sold us, I don't know, I've never been to Toronto, maybe he didn't sell us a dream, but I think there was a dream sold of that, like, well, I've come into contact with all of these different types of sounds. Like, I've been out at the club and I've heard Afro beats and I've heard New Orleans bounce and I've heard go-go, you know what I mean? Because there's so many different people where I come from that, like, when I make music, every now and then I think of that Afro beats beat or something like that. And I think to a certain extent, a lot of African Americans, at least, I think, kind of acknowledge the possibility of that. Like, living in DC before I moved to Massachusetts, I absolutely could hear 15 different genres of Black music in one night, you know what I mean? And every, you know, cultural group that was being played was represented in on the dance floor, you know what I mean? I don't know if that was Drake's experience, though. I don't know really what it means for him to be a Black man that is the one compiling all of these things together and whatnot. But I do think he kind of speaks to this idea of Blackness in music that kind of says, like, Black music is all music in a certain way, and, like, you know, therefore all Black music is fair game, which is not fair and not really true. And so I think it is difficult to grapple with. I will say, at the very least, I do appreciate him actually bringing in artists who do those genres of music in order to help him do it, and not just him being in a studio claiming he's coming up with Afro beats and, you know, no one but him is there. You know what I mean? Like, this isn't a Drake and Kanye produced, you know, song claiming Afro beats. That is when I think we'd absolutely have a moment like, okay, sir, you have gone way too far. But I don't know. I wonder how much he has leaned into Blackness so much that different cultural groups within Blackness also look to him as like a verifiable artist that they are okay with their sounds coming out.
I also wonder how much him having a like very large white audience allows him to do that, because I think a lot of white people just look at Black music as this like singular thing, that it doesn't have all these cultures that play into it. So I think a lot of people, because they haven't grown up around all these different Black cultures, they don't understand how to distinguish those things. So when he does it, we're like, oh, he's biracial, he can do that. So I wonder if that plays a lot into it. And it, you know, it makes me think a little bit more about like the J. Cole situation too, and how his white audience also allows certain things like this to happen.
I'm again the dinosaur in the room, but I'd just like to, it just seems from listening to everyone that in some respects, also a motivating force behind people's positions on feminism is distinct about the commercial, it's a commercial field we're talking about, and about protecting their marketability, and how much that's really something that should be factored in as a motivating force behind why they even feel a need to place themselves in these positions. They feel a need to speak out or just make themselves heard, to try to feel that they've done their part in what is obviously an industry that's constantly out there and being watched and is one of the hot social media areas. I don't know whether a lot of these male stars also feel threatened on some levels about not being co-opted by a Beyonce, say, or an Ariana Grande, who have tremendous following and are very popular, and they just feel that they need to try to maintain some semblance of still having the upper hand, however they go about approaching it.
Yeah, picking up on Barbara's point, I think that's a great point about the commercialism and what effect that it has. And in a number of ways. So he talks about the audiences, how the audience influences what artists can get away with, or what they're allowed to do, or what they want to do, right? What they give the audience often is a response to what the audience wants and reflects society. And with respect to things like colorism and things like that, we talked about that connection. And yeah, I just keep going back to it seems like the need for artists, as there have been throughout history, throughout American history too, but we need more artists who are willing to kind of move beyond the demands of commercialism, the demands of the market, and to do things that are important. Great art, for its own sake, or great art for the sake of justice, or of education, or of right, or something like that, as opposed to just art for the sake of getting paid for it. And so I think some of the really, some of the best artists around today probably have an element of that in their work. But I just see a real need for that, partly too because commercialism and the market, of course, reflects, especially in American society, it reflects the kind of systemic racism, colorism, sexism, all of that we have it in society. And if you have a free economic system, then your economic markets are going to reflect that pretty closely. And so the more artists just respond to economic or free market pressures, the commercial pressures, I think the more they'll just reflect what's wrong with society or problems in society and things like that, instead of educating people or pushing society towards more increased justice.
I think that's a really good point. And I also want to wrap up because we've gone a little bit over time. But next time we're going to be talking about the film industry. And I think so that was a good point to wrap up on, because not only like when we're consuming music, when we consume or like watch movies, we're seeing representation of people or understanding representations of people that we might not normally see in our day-to-day lives. So that's kind of like the only way that we can maybe gain an understanding of it. So that's why I think it's important to talk about like what are we consuming when we're watching these music videos that are based on like this kind of I don't know like the point that I'm trying to make, but essentially that it's important that we're conscious of like what we're watching and like why it was created and like what caused it to be presented to us in that way. But thank you so much for coming, and I think this went really well, so I'm glad that everyone was able to make it today, and hopefully you can come next time.